Imagine a world where your future was decided the moment you drew your first breath, not by your dreams or your spirit, but by your gender. What if your voice was trained to be soft, your movements curtailed, and your very existence tied to the will of others, day in and day out, from childhood to old age? How would it feel to live in such a reality? Not for a moment, but for a lifetime, as many women did in 920 had dash. Number 1. The erosion of self and personal identity. In the world of 920 AD, a woman's identity was rarely, if ever, her own. It was a mosaic, pieced together from the expectations of her family, her community, and the prevailing societal structures. From the chilly northern lands of the Norsemen to the sun-drenched markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and across the emerging kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England or the enduring Byzantine Empire, a woman was first a daughter, then a wife, a mother, a sister, a widow. She was defined by her relationships to men, by her reproductive capacity, and by her ability to contribute to the household economy, whether that economy was a grand manor or a humble croft. This constant external definition hammered into her consciousness from infancy served to slowly but surely erode any nascent sense of an individual self, separate and distinct from these prescribed roles. Consider young Elfgifu, growing up in a small Anglo-Saxon village. Her days were not her own. From the earliest hours, her hands were taught to grind grain, spin wool into thread, prepare meals over the hearth, and care for younger siblings. Her value was measured by her industry and her obedience. She heard stories not of independent heroines but of pious saints or virtuous wives whose ultimate achievement was a well-run household and many sons. Her desires, her thoughts, her burgeoning personality, if they deviated from this narrow path, were gently, then firmly, guided back into line. A good girl, she might hear, does not speak out of turn. A diligent daughter finds joy in her tasks. This constant shaping meant that the internal landscape of her mind was not a space for self-discovery, but rather a reflection of the external world's demands. She learned to see herself through the eyes of others, not as a unique individual, but as a functional component of a larger social unit. For a woman of the Byzantine Empire, perhaps a noblewoman named Theodora, her life was equally circumscribed, though in different ways. Her identity was intrinsically linked to her lineage and her eventual marriage alliance. Her education might include reading and writing, perhaps even some philosophy or rhetoric, but these skills were cultivated not for her personal intellectual fulfillment, but to make her a more fitting companion for a powerful husband, a better manager of a large household, or a more pious contributor to the church. Her public appearances were rare and highly ritualized, often veiled or secluded, emphasizing her purity and status as an extension of her family's honor. Her personal ambitions, if they extended beyond securing a good marriage or producing heirs, were largely irrelevant to her public persona. The expectations of her social class, the rigid protocols of the imperial court, and the deep-seated religious conservatism of the time acted as a psychological straitjacket, constricting the development of a self unburdened by these immense societal pressures. She existed, in many ways, as a symbol rather than a person with an independent inner life. Even in societies like the Abbasid Caliphate, where women had certain legal rights regarding property and divorce, the social reality for many, especially those in the elite, involved a life of seclusion. In the opulent harems, a woman's identity was often defined by her beauty, her ability to produce male heirs, or her skill in managing the internal politics of the household. While some women, like the famous poetesses or scholars, might find avenues for intellectual expression, their identities were still largely contained within the male-dominated structures of power. Concubine, for instance, might gain immense influence, but her status and very existence were utterly dependent on the caliph or powerful lord. Her personal desires, her longing for recognition beyond her physical attributes, or her childbearing, were rarely acknowledged or valued in a way that fostered a robust sense of self. She was a valuable possession, a source of pleasure, a vessel for progeny, but seldom seen as a complete person with inherent worth beyond these functions. Internal narratives she might develop about herself, if it diverged from this external valuation, would likely be a source of profound, isolating dissonance. The psychological toll of this constant external definition was immense. Without a societal framework that encouraged or even permitted the exploration of a personal identity, many women would have struggled to form one. They might find themselves asking in the quiet moments of the night, "Who am I? Beyond what is expected of me? What do I truly want?" These questions, if they even arose, would likely be met with silence, or perhaps a deep, unsettling void. The self, without the space to grow and express its unique qualities, becomes stunted, a mere shadow of its potential. This was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, insidious erosion, like water wearing away stone, leaving behind a smooth, featureless surface, where once there might have been sharp angles and distinct contours. The lack of personal identity could manifest in various ways. Some women might experience a profound sense of apathy, a feeling that nothing truly mattered beyond their daily duties, because their own desires held no weight. Why invest in personal growth or dreams when the world offered no avenue for their fulfillment? Others might internalize the societal norms so deeply that they genuinely believed their purpose was solely to serve others, losing the very capacity to imagine an alternative self. This internalization, while appearing outwardly compliant, could lead to a deep-seated inner emptiness, a spiritual hunger that could never be satisfied, because the language for it did not exist. The self, when it is merely a reflection, loses its own light. Moreover, the absence of a strong, independent self made it incredibly difficult to navigate adversity. If a woman's value was tied to her youth and beauty, what happened when age withered them? If her worth was in her fertility, what became of her if she bore no children, or only daughters? If her status depended on her husband, what was she when widowed, especially without resources or a male protector? Without an internal core of self-worth, grounded in her own inherent being, these external losses could be devastating, leading to profound despair and a feeling of utter worthlessness. There was no I to fall back on, only the shattered pieces of a role that no longer applied. The struggle to maintain any semblance of personal identity in such an environment required immense internal fortitude, often expressed in subtle, subversive ways that might not be immediately obvious to an outside observer. A woman might find a quiet joy in tending a small garden, creating intricate patterns in her weaving, or singing a particular song, finding in these small acts a fleeting moment of self-expression. Yet, these acts were often framed as extensions of her duties, not as expressions of her unique spirit. The psychological cost was the constant effort required to keep that flicker of inner self alive, an effort that drained energy and contributed to a pervasive sense of unfulfillment. The world of 920, while rich in cultural diversity and material innovation, often offered its women a psychological landscape of profound self-erasure, where the most fundamental question of "who am I?" could only be answered with "who I am told to be." Number 2. The echoing hall of social isolation. Despite living in bustling households or close-knit communities, many women in 920 AD experienced a profound sense of social isolation, an echoing emptiness even amidst the chatter of others. This was not always a physical solitude, though that could certainly occur, but rather an emotional and intellectual loneliness, stemming from the inherent power imbalances and rigid social structures that dictated their lives. True companionship, the kind that fosters genuine connection and understanding, often remained elusive. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Ingrid, living in a Viking settlement in the north. Her days are filled with activity, caring for children, preparing meals, processing foodstuffs, perhaps even assisting with farming or trade. She is surrounded by her kin, her husband, his family, and other women of the Longhouse. Yet how much of her true self could she share? Her experiences, concerns, and fears might revolve around the safety of her husband on a raiding journey, the health of her children, or the success of the harvest. The social hierarchy, often male-dominated, meant that her opinions on matters beyond the domestic sphere were rarely sought or valued. Her voice might be heard, but her perspective might not truly register. This created a barrier to deep reciprocal communication. She might exchange pleasantries, discuss practical matters, or even gossip, but the avenues for sharing her inner world, her true feelings about her limited choices, or her anxieties were often closed off. Constant pressure to maintain a stoic demeanor, a necessary trait in a harsh world, further stifled emotional intimacy. She might feel a sense of camaraderie with other women, but often it was a camaraderie born of shared struggle rather than shared vulnerability. For a woman in a privileged position, say Lady Mathilde in a Frankish castle, the isolation could be even more acute. While she might command servants and oversee a complex household, her social interactions were highly formalized. Her husband was her lord, not necessarily her confidant. Her marriage was likely arranged, based on alliances and property, not personal affection. Her children would be raised largely by wet nurses and tutors, with limited intimate bonding time. Her female companions might be other noblewomen, but their relationships were often tinged with rivalry over status, influence, or the favor of powerful men. The very structure of noble society, with its emphasis on reputation and strict adherence to etiquette, made genuine emotional honesty a perilous endeavor. A single misstep, a perceived weakness, or an inappropriate expression of feeling could jeopardize her family's standing or her own security. She might find herself living in a gilded cage, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone with her thoughts and feelings. Castle walls, while offering protection, also served as a psychological barrier, amplifying her emotional solitude. In the vast monastic communities that offered an alternative path for some women in medieval Europe, like Sister Agnes in the Benedictine convent, there was a different form of isolation. While surrounded by other women dedicated to a spiritual life, the emphasis on communal prayer, silence, and self-denial could limit individual expression. The focus was on the collective spiritual journey, not necessarily on individual emotional needs. While some strong friendships might form within the cloister, the very nature of monastic life, separating women from the wider world and often from their families, inherently involved a degree of personal detachment. The spiritual purity that was sought often came at the cost of worldly intimacy, leaving some souls with a quiet longing for a connection that transcended shared ritual. Across cultures, the lack of opportunities for intellectual or emotional exchange with peers who truly understood their plight contributed significantly to this isolation. Women were often denied formal education equal to men or access to scholarly pursuits. This meant that conversations, when they occurred, were often practical or superficial. There were few avenues for women to discuss abstract ideas, philosophical questions, or even their deepest emotional turmoil with someone who could genuinely empathize or offer a fresh perspective. The absence of spaces where women could speak freely and openly without judgment or fear of reprisal meant that many thoughts and feelings remained unspoken, festering within. The psychological toll of this pervasive social isolation was profound. Could lead to a deep-seated loneliness, a feeling of being unseen and unheard, even when surrounded by others. This chronic loneliness could manifest as a sense of detachment, a feeling of observing one's own life from a distance, rather than fully participating in it. It could also contribute to depression, as the human need for connection and belonging went largely unmet. Without a trusted confidant, A woman might bear her burdens alone, allowing them to grow heavier with each passing day. The emotional resonance that comes from shared experience, from truly being understood by another human being, was often absent, leaving an echoing hall within the mind where true self-expression yearned to break free but found no open door. This was not a dramatic, sudden pain, but a quiet, persistent ache, like a constant pressure on the soul. Number 3. The heavy veil of learned helplessness. Imagine being told in countless subtle and overt ways that your efforts to change your circumstances are futile, that your individual will is insignificant against the tide of destiny and male authority. For many women in 920 AD, this was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, leading to the profound psychological toll of learned helplessness. This was a state where, having repeatedly experienced situations beyond their control, they ceased to even try to exert control, even when avenues for action might technically exist. It was a heavy veil descending upon their spirit, stifling initiative and fostering a deep, pervasive apathy. Consider the life of a peasant woman, perhaps named Alara, in a Saxon village. Her days were a relentless cycle of labor, tilling the soil, tending livestock, harvesting crops, processing food, raising children, all under the shadow of the local lord. Her life was largely dictated by the seasons, the winds of nature, and the demands of her husband and the manorial system. If the harvest failed, she starved. If her husband was abusive, she had little recourse, as legal and social structures offered scant protection. If she disagreed with her husband or her father, her opinion was dismissed, perhaps with a harsh word or a blow. After countless instances where her opinions were ignored, her desires overridden, and her efforts to improve her lot met with failure or punishment, a profound sense of futility would set in. Why bother speaking up? Why try to innovate when the outcome was predetermined? This led to a passive resignation, a sense that this is just how things are, and how they will always be. She might cease to even consider alternatives, accepting her fate with a quiet, weary stoicism. For a woman of higher status, perhaps a daughter of a wealthy merchant in Cordoba, named Fatima, the learned helplessness manifested differently but was equally potent. Her marriage would almost certainly be arranged for economic or social advantage. She might dream of pursuing knowledge, of engaging in trade, or even managing her own assets, yet her education would be tailored to domestic duties, her movements confined to the women's quarters, and her financial decisions subject to male oversight. Even if she possessed shrewd intellect and autumnal spirit, the societal barriers to her independent action were immense. She might witness other women who tried to assert themselves face social censure, economic hardship, or even physical isolation. Over time, she would learn that her personal ambition was a dangerous and ultimately fruitless endeavor. She might internalize the idea that her intelligence was best applied to managing her household efficiently, or that her true power lay in subtle manipulation rather than direct action. This shift from active agency to passive adaptation, though outwardly appearing as compliance, was a form of psychological surrender. The spark of initiative, repeatedly extinguished, eventually flickered out, leaving behind a dull sense of resignation. The legal and social codes of 920 had consistently reinforced this sense of powerlessness. In many European regions, a woman was considered a legal minor throughout her life, passing from the guardianship of her father to her husband. Her property, if she had any, often became her husband's upon marriage. Her testimony in court might be valued less than a man's. Divorce, though present in some cultures, was often difficult for a woman to initiate, or depended heavily on male consent or religious decree. These structural limitations, consistently applied, taught women that their lives were fundamentally controlled by external forces and male figures. This constant reinforcement created a psychological landscape where personal agency was not only devalued, but actively discouraged. The psychological consequence of learned helplessness was a profound reduction in personal initiative and emotional vitality. A woman might appear listless, unmotivated, even apathetic. She might lose interest in activities she once enjoyed simply because the effort felt meaningless. The ability to problem-solve independently would diminish, as she had learned that others would make decisions for her or that her solutions would be ignored. This could lead to a quiet despair, a sense that her life was happening to her rather than through her. The once vibrant inner landscape could become barren, her spirit dulled by the constant weight of external control. Furthermore, learned helplessness could impact a woman's ability to recognize or seize opportunities for improvement, even small ones. If a new technique for spinning appeared, she might not bother to learn it, believing it would make little difference to her overall lot. If a chance to share a grievance arose, she might remain silent, convinced it would only lead to further disappointment. This passivity was not a natural state, but a conditioned response, a profound psychological scar left by a lifetime of limited autonomy. It meant that even if a rare window of opportunity opened, she might lack the internal fortitude or the belief in her own efficacy to step through it. The heavy veil of learned helplessness once descended was incredibly difficult to lift, binding a woman's spirit in chains far more insidious than any physical restraint. It was a mental cage, built brick by brick from repeated experiences of powerlessness, leaving her with a profound, quiet sense of despair. Number 4. The constant companion of anxiety and fear. Living as a woman in 920 had often meant navigating a world permeated by constant anxiety and deeply rooted fears. These were not merely fleeting worries, but a pervasive psychological state stemming from economic precarity, social vulnerability, and the ever-present threat of violence or loss, often with little recourse or protection. The lack of control over one's own destiny and the severe consequences of social transgression created a fertile ground for a chronic state of apprehension. Consider the anxieties of a young bride, perhaps named Solveig, married into a family in a volatile region of the Carolingian Empire. Her life is now bound to a man she may barely know, in a household of strangers. Her primary duty is to produce heirs, specifically sons, to ensure the continuation of the family line. The fear of infertility, or of bearing only daughters, would be a constant gnawing worry. Her status, her very acceptance within her new family, depended upon her womb. Every monthly cycle, every pregnancy, would be fraught with immense psychological pressure. The risk of childbirth itself was terrifyingly high. Many women died in labor. If she survived, there was the anxiety of her children surviving infancy in a world ravaged by disease and famine. Her existence was intertwined with the biological lottery, creating a profound, inescapable source of fear. Beyond the biological, economic anxieties were immense. For a woman in a rural setting like the aforementioned Alara, the fear of crop failure, animal disease, or famine was ever present. Her family's survival, and thus her own, depended on the land's bounty and her hard work. Yet so much was beyond her control. A bad harvest could mean starvation, and for a woman, especially a widow, it could mean destitution and complete loss of social standing. The fear of being left without a male protector, of becoming a burden, or being forced into dire straits was a constant shadow, even for women in towns. The economic fluctuations and the fragility of trade created anxieties about livelihood and security. The inability to independently own significant property or engage freely in commerce meant that a woman's economic fate was often inextricably linked to a male relative, a source of constant, low-level dread. Social fears were equally potent. Reputation was everything in 920. and a woman's honor was a fragile thing, easily shattered by rumor or accusation. The fear of social ostracization, of being gossiped about, of losing her good name, or of being cast out, loomed large. A woman who was perceived to be immodest, rebellious, or even simply unlucky could face severe social consequences, including public shaming, physical punishment, or even abandonment. For noble women, the fear of scandal could destroy political alliances and ruin families. This constant need to conform, to always appear virtuous and obedient, created an exhausting mental burden. Every interaction, every public appearance, could be a source of anxiety, as she meticulously managed her demeanor to avoid any hint of impropriety. Then there was the undeniable threat of physical violence. While not unique to women, the forms of violence they faced often stemmed from their subordinate status. The threat of abduction, especially for noble women as pawns in political struggles or for peasant women during raids, was real. Domestic violence, while often unrecorded, was likely a pervasive issue, with women having little legal recourse. The fear of a husband's anger, a father's wrath, or the cruelty of an in-law was a grim reality for many. This created a state of hypervigilance where a woman might constantly monitor the moods of those around her, attempting to anticipate and avoid potential conflict. This continuous state of alertness, a psychological fight or flight response perpetually activated, led to chronic stress and exhaustion. The psychological toll of this constant anxiety and fear was immense. It could manifest as insomnia, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, and a pervasive sense of unease. The mind, constantly scanning for threats, would find little respite. Joy might be fleeting, always tempered by the underlying current of dread. Some women might develop nervous habits or become withdrawn, seeking to minimize exposure to potential harms. Others might internalize the fear, leading to a crippling lack of confidence and an inability to assert themselves, even in minor ways. The weight of this invisible companion, anxiety, pressed down on every aspect of a woman's life in 920, at shaping her choices, limiting her horizons, and often robbing her of peace of mind. It was a silent torment, an unceasing hum of apprehension in the background of her existence. Number 5. The stifled scream of suppressed emotion. Imagine a life where expressing your true feelings, particularly anger, frustration, or profound sadness, was not only discouraged but actively punished. For women, in 920, the societal norms and power structures often demanded an outward composure, a quiet submission that forced a deeply unhealthy suppression of their emotional lives. This led to a stifled scream, an internal cacophony of unexpressed feelings that had nowhere to go, festering within the psyche and causing immense psychological distress. Consider a young woman, perhaps named Kenna, living in a rural Irish community. She might be forced into an early marriage with a much older man, or witness her sisters being bartered for alliances. Her personal preferences, her hopes for companionship, would be utterly disregarded. How could she express the bitter disappointment, the sense of betrayal, or the silent rage at her lack of agency? Cry out, to protest vehemently, would likely be met with swift and harsh reprisal from her family, her husband, or the community elders. She would be branded as disobedient, ungrateful, or even hysterical, traits that could jeopardize her very survival or worsen her circumstances. Therefore, she learned to bite her tongue, to lower her gaze, to present an outward face of quiet acceptance. The anger, however, did not vanish. It curdled within. For a woman of the Byzantine court, say a noblewoman named Zoe, the suppression was often more subtle but equally powerful. She might be politically astute, observing the machinations of the court, the treachery, and the injustices. She might feel a burning indignation at the mistreatment of servants, the betrayal of allies, or the foolishness of her male relatives. Yet, to express these feelings openly would be to invite disaster, A woman's emotional displays, especially those deemed unfeminine like open anger or ambition, could be interpreted as weakness, a lack of self-control, or even a threat. She learned to mask her true feelings with polite smiles, veiled remarks, or quiet maneuvers behind the scenes. Her frustration would find no direct outlet, remaining locked away, a silent scream echoing in the chambers of her own mind. The sophisticated layers of courtly etiquette served as elaborate emotional restraints, keeping her passions in check at all times. Even the everyday frustrations of a woman's life in 920 had often had to be suppressed. The constant, back-breaking labor, the pain of childbirth, the grief of losing a child, the indignity of being spoken over or dismissed, these were experiences that elicited powerful emotions. Yet, there was little societal permission to fully feel or express these. A woman was expected to be stoic, resilient, and always focused on her duties. Complain excessively, to shed too many tears, or to show overt signs of resentment was seen as weakness, as selfishness, or as a lack of piety. The social pressure to endure silently was immense. The psychological toll of this widespread emotional suppression was profound. Unexpressed anger could turn inward, manifesting as chronic irritability, a pervasive bitterness, or even physical ailments like headaches, digestive issues, or chronic pain. Constant effort required to maintain a facade of composure was immensely draining, leading to exhaustion and a feeling of emotional numbness. Unacknowledged grief could lead to prolonged periods of melancholy and despair. Without healthy outlets for emotional processing, women might find themselves trapped in cycles of rumination, replaying injustices in their minds, deepening their internal suffering. Moreover, the inability to express emotions could lead to a distorted sense of self and relationships. How could genuine intimacy flourish when one half of the partnership was constantly guarding her true feelings? The lack of emotional honesty could create distance even within families, leading to a sense of profound loneliness and misunderstanding. A woman might become adept at passive-aggressive behaviors, or find her frustrations emerging in subtle, often indirect ways, due to the lack of direct avenues for expression. In some cases, the pressure to suppress emotions might lead to a complete detachment, where a woman effectively shut down her emotional life as a coping mechanism. This might allow her to function outwardly, but it came at the cost of true emotional vitality, leaving her feeling hollow or indifferent. The stifled scream became a silent, internal torment, a constant psychological burden that permeated every aspect of her being, leaving her with an unseen weight of unacknowledged pain. The world of 920, and while valuing Stoicism, often did so at the expense of its women's emotional health, creating generations of individuals carrying a heavy, silent burden of unexpressed feeling. Number 6. The invisible chains of lost agency. Imagine waking each day knowing that nearly every significant decision about your life, from whom you would marry, where you would live, to how your children would be raised, and even what tasks you would perform, was largely beyond your control. This pervasive lack of autonomy, a constant presence for women in 920 AD, created invisible chains, binding their spirits and leading to a profound psychological toll, the crushing weight of lost agency. This wasn't merely about limitations, but about the deeply internalized feeling that one's own will, preferences, and desires were inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Consider the life of a young woman named Alara, the daughter of a peasant farmer in the emerging kingdom of Wessex. Her marriage was not a matter of choice or affection, but a strategic alliance for her family, perhaps to secure more land, settle a debt, or strengthen ties with a neighboring family. She might be married to a man she barely knew, or one who was much older. Her dissent, if she dared voice it, would be swiftly dismissed as childish or disobedient. Once married, her agency further diminished. Her labor, her body, her very existence were legally and socially subsumed under her husband's authority. She could not own land independently, engage in significant trade without her husband's permission, or even choose where she would spend her days without his approval. Her day was dictated by the endless cycle of agricultural tasks, household chores, and childcare, with little room for personal initiative. The psychological impact of having one's life path chosen, rather than chosen by oneself, is immense. It fosters a feeling of being a pawn, a tool, rather than an active participant in one's own existence. For a noble woman, such as Lady Isolde in a Frankish duchy, the constraints were equally real, though perhaps wrapped in silk and privilege. Her marriage, too, would be a political negotiation, determining her family's power, land holdings, or diplomatic alliances. She might be sent across vast distances to marry a stranger, leaving behind everything familiar. Her primary agency might lie in her ability to produce male heirs, thus securing her husband's lineage and her own position. Even this biological function was externally imposed, a duty rather than a choice. Her daily life, though managed by servants, was still highly structured by social expectations and the need to maintain a household that reflected her husband's status. She could not travel freely, pursue her own intellectual interests outside of prescribed learning, or manage her property independently without her husband's or father's consent. Her influence, if any, was usually through indirect persuasion or subtle manipulation of male relatives rather than direct exercise of her own will. Constant awareness that her choices were merely variations within a narrow, predetermined framework fostered a deep sense of powerlessness. Even in societies like the Abbasid Caliphate, where women had certain legal rights not found in all Western regions, the social reality often constrained agency. A woman in a wealthy urban family might technically own property or have the right to initiate divorce under specific circumstances. However, her life was often lived in seclusion within the confines of the women's quarters, the harem for Elid, limiting her movement and external interactions. Her intellectual pursuits might be encouraged, but often within specific boundaries. For instance, while some women became renowned scholars, their public roles were still largely mediated by male figures. The social pressure to conform to strict codes of modesty and obedience meant that even if legal avenues existed, the practical exercise of true personal agency was often curtailed by fear of social ostracization or familial disapproval. To step outside these invisible boundaries was to risk one's reputation, security, and even life. The psychological toll of this pervasive lack of agency was profound. It could lead to a chronic sense of frustration, a feeling of being trapped. Without the ability to make meaningful choices about one's own life, motivation could dwindle. Why strive? Why innovate when the path is already laid out and your efforts to deviate are met with resistance or failure? This could result in a pervasive sense of apathy, a resignation to one's fate, where the individual ceases to dream or plan for a different future. The constant suppression of one's own will could lead to a deep-seated inner emptiness, a quiet despair that stemmed from the unfulfilled potential of self-determination. Furthermore, the loss of agency could erode self-efficacy, the belief in one's own ability to influence events and achieve goals. When repeated experiences teach a woman that her actions have little impact on her life's trajectory, she stops trying. This can manifest as an inability to make even small decisions, a reliance on others for guidance, or a pervasive sense of helplessness in the face of challenges. The invisible chains, though not physically palpable, were profoundly real in their psychological impact, leaving many women in 920 AD with a profound sense of being adrift, their sails trimmed by the winds of external command, unable to chart their own course. The world in many ways acted upon them rather than through them. creating a deep and lasting psychological burden of a life unchosen.